Thank you. Good morning, everybody. So, my name is Jason Richling, and I'm a planner with the Bureau of Development Services, which is the city's current planning and development department. So we have building official, we have fire and life safety staff, we have other bureau staff like environmental services, water. In addition, I'm part of the land use services team, which is tasked with current development in the city. When you see a new building being constructed anywhere, whether it be an ADU, whether it be an office tower, our department's involved. And so I'm on a team of planners who deal with that. My talk today is going to be about accessory dwelling units specifically. We see a lot of these today in particular, and we'll get into reasons why that is. Some of the zoning code standards for what needs to occur to meet code criteria to get an ADU constructed, and some of the issues that we run into pretty commonly when we're looking at an ADU permit, what that approval process looks like, what kind of flexibility there might be in the design of these, and then lastly, we'll talk about just what's coming next, what things are in the pipeline for ADUs in the city. So first I want to start by backing out to the 30,000 foot level. In the regulatory context, the city's comprehensive plan, which is a 20-year plan for how the city is going to look in terms of providing housing and employment and land area, accommodate all of those things, addresses housing in a number of ways. It talks for supporting transit-supportive urban densities and providing for a mix of housing within the urban environment, including age-in-place options. Metro's 2040 growth concept also talks about compact, land-efficient development patterns, and statewide land planning goal 10, I believe, is the housing goal. Also talks about providing housing for the populace through various income levels. So all those things conspired to the creation of our zoning code, which is, though it's at the bottom, it's all very important. It implements that comprehensive plan, that broader 20-year vision, and it specifically called out ADUs in the early 20th century. They were very common across the country. But after World War II, with the kind of the rise of more the detached suburbia, it became a little less common. And a lot of jurisdictions simply started to outlaw, but Portland was not one of those. So in doing my research coming into today, it looked like even back into the 40s, there's mention of accessory residential dwellings on lots. And so I don't know, the regulations probably have not always been the same, but the theme has always been allowed. And so, what is an accessory dwelling unit? Well, there are probably a whole rainbow of definitions out there, but the zoning code calls it a second dwelling unit created on a lot with a house, attached house, or manufactured home. And the important piece on that is that's in a residential zone. You have commercial zones that allow residential uses, and they do not allow ADUs because there is no limitation necessarily on density in those type of zones. It's always auxiliary and smaller than the house, the primary structure on the lot. So there are massive amount of pictures out there about ADUs. I pulled a few, from your and back I go with my pointer. Your classic detached cottage. Sometimes you see them constructed as an attached unit to a garage. Sometimes they're incorporated into the house itself. Other times, again, this detached cottage type of feel, which is very common, especially in this part of town. So where can you build an ADU in the city of Portland? Well, if you look at this map, this is the very, very high elevation zoning map for the city. And so where you see these yellow marks here, that's all residential zoning. And so essentially anywhere in a residential zone in town, if you have a house, attached house, or a manufactured home, the potential is there to construct an ADU. So where are the ADUs being constructed? Well, mostly, they're throughout town for sure. But they're very concentrated in, what are sort of the older streetcar, classic streetcar network type of neighborhoods, with the highest concentrations in, no surprise, Alberta, Hawthorne, Interstate, Hollywood, Lentz, Selwood, and Moreland down there. You also see concentrations near University of Portland, into North Portland as well. So they're everywhere in town, but they're very concentrated between the river and 205. And the data really bears this out. So the bottom part of this is cut off, unfortunately, but each of these represents 1 year between 1995 and 2013. And you can see that clearly there's been a rise in ADU permits in recent years, specifically since 2009. We'll get into why that is. But you can see that the inner neighborhoods there are really where they're concentrated. They certainly exist to the west, they certainly exist out east, but they're very concentrated in the inner neighborhoods between the river and 205. So this is not at all encompassing, but these are some of the usual suspects we see coming into the Bureau of Development Services. When people visit us at our offices on 1900 South of the 4th, we're often talking about one of these options. If you're adding to an existing home, if you're converting a basement to an ADU, you might be converting a garage to an ADU, or constructing a freestanding ADU all on its own. And so the rules are written. They're not quite one size fits all. There's enough flexibility where you can accomplish any of these things, but there are certain nuances that have to be paid attention depending on what type you're proposing. So we have a set of ADU design standards. So the important chapter in our code, if you're familiar with where that is online, and I'll have an info page at the end that tells you where, is chapter 33.205. That is the ADU chapter. And so it lists, among other things, some general design standards for ADUs. Entrances, if it's an attached unit, the entrance, only one entrance faces the street. The idea is that from the street, the structure reads as a one primary building, not a multiple entrance type of structure. The maximum size, this is a very common issue that comes up, is limited to the lesser of 75% of the living area of the house, or 800 square feet. It's really to limit it. We have a 3,000 square foot home. You're going to say 75% of that can be an ADU. It's going to have to be a small cottage-sized structure. The exterior finish material has to match or visually be the same as what's on the existing home. And sometimes the existing home has a number of different finishes, and you certainly have the ability to pick and choose. But the idea is to replicate the pattern to make this look like it fits into the neighborhood. It's really a compatibility feel that we're looking for. Roof pitch, the same as the predominant pitch on the home itself. The trim, gets down to the specifics, the trim around the windows, the doors, the roof edges, the corners. If that exists on the home in some way, we need to see that replicated on the ADU. That's what we'll be looking for when we're looking at a permit. Windows, this is another common issue that comes up. Windows need to match the primary residence and their orientation, relationship of height to width, whether they're mostly horizontal, whether they're mostly vertical, whether they're paired or triple, whether they're round, triangular. We're looking for those same things to be reflected on an ADU. And again, ADUs typically primary residences often have a large number of window types, and any of those can be replicated or not replicated on an ADU as long as some of them are. That's what we're looking for. Now, probably the least restrictive that we have is eaves. Eaves are either a foot or they match the house. A foot at least or they match the house. And there's a lot of flexibility there. There are a few additional standards that we look for when we're reviewing detached ADUs. Two of the biggest are it's either going to need to be 60 feet from a front lot line, from the street lot line, or 6 feet behind the primary residence. It's or, it's not and. And so for a lot of Portland's standard 50 by 100 or 30 by 100 lots, you see this a lot. I mean, this isn't difficult to accomplish typically with a detached unit. The height of a detached unit is measured to the midpoint of the gable between the peak of the roof and the eave, the midpoint there. 18 feet is what we're looking for with a detached structure. The bulk limitation, so all detached buildings on the side, sheds, greenhouses, detached ADU, all of those things are limited to 15% the site area. So that's not all that restrictive. Where it gets trickier is when it's a site that already has 3 or 4 detached buildings. We are looking at the aggregate there. Parking, no additional parking is required for an ADU. What we are looking for when we see a permit for an ADU, especially converting an existing garage, is that parking, if it's required for the house, is still provided on the site after the ADU is constructed. Often that's not problematic if it's a deep driveway. It can be in a garage or in a carport, but we have to have it exist. So we have a parking pad for the house. And then to add sort of another layer of what we're looking for on these are other zoning code regulations. There's an space, other than just we would have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. The setbacks, usually we're looking at a 5-foot rear setback, 5-foot side setbacks, things like that with the ADUs. It's typically not too hard to accomplish. Required outdoor parking, again, we're preserving parking if it's required, and we're preserving outdoor space if it's required to be there, depending on the zone. Density, we sort of play at two different directions with the density with ADUs to encourage their development. If you're in a single-family zone or single-dwelling zone, we don't care about the density at all with an ADU. We don't say you're putting 2 units on a lot and therefore you're over density. You're simply allowed to do it by right. If you're in a multifamily zone, if you're adding an ADU, it can help you to meet your minimum density. You might have a lot that, say you have a 4,000 square foot lot and the minimum density is 1 unit per 2,000, so you have to put 2. You can do that with a house and an ADU, not necessarily 2 units that are of equal size. Conversely, if you're over density already, you're right at your maximum density, and then you want to add an ADU, we don't stop you from doing that. It does not contribute to maximum density. So we try and really make it, really make it integrated into the fabric of the urban environment here, based on the realities of what we're trying to achieve by adding density, compatibility. We're trying to make this a process people can get through with relative ease. We also have, Portland's code is about that thick. So we have a lot of complexity, overlay zones, planned districts, historic features. Really the best thing to do if any of those are in play is to talk to the list of things that need to be fixed in order to get this approved. Another thing that we see is conversion of existing space, a basement or an addition to a house, attic space. That is, they all require permits, but those are reviewed as alterations or additions, and those, in some cases, can be actually done over the counter. It's extremely rare. Usually you're looking at turning in permits and having us review that. The submittal requirements are pretty standardized. There's a need for a site plan showing property boundaries, the main residence, where vehicle driveways might be, any other outlying structures, where the proposed ADU is going to be, drawn to scale so that we can make some measurements and evaluate it against the code. Building elevations of both the ADU and the house. We need to be able to confirm that it in fact does meet those compatibility design standards that we talked about. Cross-section drawings, our building plan review staff are going to need to be able to look at the structural components and ensure that it meets Oregon's specialty codes for single-family or two-family housing. Floor plans, so that we can adequately evaluate the square footage of this ADU. Now we're looking at the living area of an ADU. We're measuring inside wall to inside wall, so we are not including the thickness of the walls. So if you're putting together plans and you're coming up with a number that's just a little too big, retake that measurement for the inside walls. It may be able to make the difference to make it meet the code. If not, there's a process for exceptions, and we'll get into what those are. So I'm just going to walk through a couple common situations that we see, things that we run across all the time, and just to highlight that these do exist, and there might, there are some remedies for these. So converting a detached garage that's in what we call a side and rear setback. So here's a lot that I pulled off the internet here and drew in a side setback line. Today, if you came in with a new ADU, it wouldn't let you construct it in that 5-foot setback. It would have to be outside of it. But if you have an existing detached building and it meets certain criteria, like it was built before 2005, at least 40 feet from the front lot line, no bigger than 24 by 24. There's a couple other things about the height. And you're going to just convert it as is. It's not going to be made taller, made wider, made longer. It's just going to be now an ADU. It's going to have a door on it instead of a garage door. You can do that. But you have to use it as is. And if anything changes, then that triggers needing to comply with the code and potentially ask for what we call an adjustment. With that same scenario, this just kind of walks through what we're looking for here. It's how we measure height, the midpoint between the gable and the peak. Looking for a 15-foot height limit on that, 10 feet for the walls. This is again with that existing garage that's being turned into an ADU, and maybe it doesn't meet a setback or something. If you can meet the code as it is, then these probably aren't requirements that are problematic. But we do see a lot of this particular scenario in the permit center. The next scenario is an ADU that doesn't match the primary residence. You know, commonly, you're looking at a modern type design, such as this lower example, where people want to do some green elements, like a green roof or an eco roof. The house doesn't necessarily have that. That isn't going to meet the code. It isn't something that's going to be approvable without what we call an adjustment. And so just to know coming in the door, if it isn't going to meet one of these things as you walk through these standards, it's best to know before you ever come in that you're looking probably at an adjustment, and then we can have that conversation about what the process is and how to apply for that. Another situation we see, and it's one of those out that, oh gosh, I didn't realize the siding was wrong, the roof was wrong, what have you. If you apply for this adjustment, it's a land use review, and I don't know how many folks have been through the land use process. It does involve discretion. You're basically saying, you're making an argument against with approval criteria, saying, I meet the spirit of the code. However, I don't meet the word of the code. I meet the intent, but I don't meet the actual letter of it. And you're making your argument based on that. And there's a little more to it than that. I would certainly suggest calling us up or visiting us to talk about that. But it does provide for flexibility in unusual situations like that basement situation or others. It does involve notification to the neighbors or the surrounding property owners, as well as the neighborhood association and coalition. So there's some public involvement component. It does not require a public hearing, but it can be appealed to one. So it can take some time. You should count on at least 60 days in your building timeline if you know you have to go through an adjustment. As far as fees go, fees are very, very variable, and so I'm not going to give you some sort of sense of, oh, it's about this much. Some ADUs the conversion costs $10,000, some ADUs are new and cost $90,000, and it's all based on the valuation of the work that's being proposed. The very best way to estimate your fees without actually coming in and applying is to go to our online fee estimator. So our website is portlandoregon.gov/BDS. And the part that's circled here is where you can estimate your fees, and that's where you can plug in the type of project you're doing, whatever it be. It doesn't have to be an ADU. It can be anything. It's going to require a permit. And you can get a sense at that point of what your fee structure is going to look like, and decide, make some decisions after that of how you want to proceed. Do you want to apply for that adjustment also? Adjustments have a price tag of about just under $1,900. So they're not, it's not nothing. But you can make some good informed decisions after you estimate your fees on what you want to go forward with for an ADU. One very positive thing that Portland is doing in the realm of fees and ADUs is, at this time, system development charges, which are impact fees for traffic, for parks, for water service, for sanitary and storm sewer, those at this time are waived for accessory dwelling units. So the purpose of that is to incent development, really get people to come in and apply for these. My understanding is that this represents a savings of about $11,000 for an ADU, so it's a very substantial thing to be waiving these fees. It will not last forever. It does expire at the end of July in 2016, but there certainly are a few more years where this will be in play, and I would assume we'll see the effect by people coming in and applying for more and more ADUs. All other non-SDC fees are due at the time of permit issuance. Again, if you want to get a sense of what those are, our online fee estimator is the very best way to find that out. And so, when you look at this graph here, you can really get a good sense of right about when the SDC waiver came into effect. It's something on there that jumps out at you. So between 2009 and present, almost an order of magnitude difference in the number of ADU permits that we're seeing. I think we had something like 22 or 23 that year, and nearly 200 in 2013. So far in 2014, probably about 60 in the queue, and it's early. So, I would certainly expect that trend to certainly not drop, maybe level off or continue up. But certainly what this says is that the incentive is working. People are coming in based on this and making use of this to get an ADU of some variety onto their lot. So what's coming down the pipeline? So ADUs, and you may have heard that they potentially are impacted by some of the upcoming zone changes or code changes that are proposed. And I should make a plug right now that on the 4th of June, there is a city council hearing on my And among the things they'll be talking about are these short-term rentals. And they could make a decision that day, they could continue the hearing, but June 4th at 2 p.m. at City Hall is where the hearing is going to occur. It's already been through the city's planning commission, and so it's moving right along. But effectively, short-term rentals, things like Airbnb, they're sort of the new bed and breakfast. And so the proposal is to change the verbiage in our code from bed and breakfast to short-term rental. And really, the way it affects ADUs is under today's code, you could live in a house and you could rent an ADU as a bed and breakfast, so to speak. Under the new code, flexibility would exist to actually live in an ADU and rent the house out. And there's a couple different processes to get there, and I would highly recommend going to the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability website and reading through this Recap 6 document if you want to know the really specifics of what that code language says, because it very likely becomes reality after not too long. Even if they make a decision on the 4th, it'll be sometime until it's in effect, but it looks like that's probably the direction it's going. As far as ADU-related code changes, to the design elements I talked about, to the size elements I talked about, there are none currently in this regulatory improvement package. They are, however, on our, what we call our regulatory improvement request list. There are a number of requests to have another look at the ADU standards, look at how we're approving these, what the issues are, and see if there are ways to clarify some of those items and/or maybe build in flexibility. But those might be addressed in some future code amendment process, but today they're not a part of the proposal at present. And so finally, I would leave off with, we have a vast list of online resources. Notwithstanding, accessorydwellings.org, Mr. Peterson's website, which is enormously helpful. The city also, we have our BDS webpage, portlandoregon.gov/BDS. And if you want to know about upcoming code changes, the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, mostly the same web address, but at the end it's BPS. And that's where that regulatory improvement list lives. It's where you can find out what the latest and proposed zoning changes are. The zoning code, portlandoregon.gov again, at /zoning code. We try and make that relatively easy, and again, that chapter I reference is 33.205 for accessory dwelling unit regs. If you want to perform online research, look up your property, find out what your zone is, see what kind of issues, if there are any overlays. You can do that from the comfort of your own home at portlandmaps.com. You type in your address, and you can look up your own site. Also, the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality has a very useful website put together. They have links to today's event. They also have links to a 2013 ADU survey that was performed among people who own ADUs in, I believe it's in Portland, Eugene, a number of other jurisdictions, really talking about how they're being used, what type of housing it really is. Is it a rental unit? Is family living there? Just getting a sense of how are these things being integrated into our community. It's extremely informative. I'd recommend if you have some time to check that out. And I would always recommend if you have any questions or would like to just come in and have a conversation, we staff our Development Services Center at 1900 Southwest 4th Avenue on the first floor, 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. every day. I think like Tuesday we close at 2. We have planners like myself on staff, a whole team of people. We can also talk to service bureaus, talk about water service, electrical service, fire life safety concerns. Face-to-face, have that conversation, and you can walk away with useful information. I would always recommend that as a step, and maybe an early step in looking at whatever you can do as far as applying for an ADU. And with that, that's what I have, so thank you very much. And I think we have a few minutes. We do. Are we doing a time?
Yeah.
All right. Yes.
Can you talk about, is there a timeline or deadline for either from the time of submittal permits or pulling permits to get CFO? And the second question, if I may, is I think, is there a square footage that where energy criteria can get done?
So, I guess my caveat off the top will say probably both those places are not my area of expertise, but permit timeline.
Can you repeat the question each time?
Oh, yeah, so she asked two things. One, what the timeline was for once a permit is issued, when you need to get a certificate of occupancy. And the next was, is there a building square footage at which, beyond which, I think it was beyond which energy efficiency becomes more important? Or required. So for the zoning code, at present, the zoning code itself does not require you to meet any particular energy standard. I think in general, there are a lot of studies out there that I know one good reason to build small is that it is much more materials efficient, land efficient, and energy efficient in general. Probably some of our leading speakers, or maybe even Mr. Peterson, could talk about the energy efficiency piece. As far as the C of O goes, when a permit is issued, my understanding is there's a 6-month period in which you need to be demonstrating that work is continuing. If that 6-month period passes and nothing has occurred, you would either need to apply for an extension or begin work on the project. I don't think that, I think that can be continued for some time. I don't know exactly what that time frame is. So I'll go back there first.
Okay, so this is kind of a general question. My property doesn't have a garage, but I think it did at one time. Does that affect the process, and how can I research to find out how big that garage was? Where do I start with that?
Sure. So she had asked if her property once had a garage, it's no longer there. Where could she come in and get some information on what used to be constructed, where was it, what was the square footage? We don't, there are probably a couple different answers to that. The city's code doesn't require that you have a garage. And if it's gone today, we probably couldn't look at that as one of those existing, permitted before 2005 garages that you could convert. But if you wanted information, probably the best place to come by is this Development Services Center on the first floor of the 1900 building. We have a resource and records counter where you can provide your address, and they can provide you with copies of all the permits that go back to the early 20th century. We actually have handwritten pencil permits from the 20s. That really will describe, the types of development that were approved out there. They might cite the square footage. Sometimes there isn't that level of detail, how older it is. But that would be a great place to start with your research. So, I think you probably talk about this scenario again here, a garage where you're converting a garage. If it accommodates 2 parking places, you need to be replacing 2 parking places. So the city's regulation for parking is 1 parking space is required for a single detached dwelling. So for this house here, they only need 1 space. There's also a front setback line. As long as you're providing a space on a paved surface, a driveway, that's, we need a 9-foot wide by 18-foot deep space outside of that front setback, which is typically about 10 feet. If you still have that after the conversion, then there's really nothing more to do. You simply also then have your space. And then the idea with the ADU is to share, if they want on-site parking, you can simply share that space with them, or they can park on the street. But there wouldn't be a requirement to put 2 back. Yes, sir.
I'm from a community in another state which has not embraced this concept yet. We'd like to introduce this concept. And could you tell us a little bit about the history of where you started and how you got to the point where it's really, it seems to be running smoothly. And I would imagine there was a resistance at the beginning, and that resistance on the subject.
Right, so the question was, in communities outside of Portland, maybe this is a newer idea to, sort of describing the history of ADUs in Portland and how we've gotten to where we are today, and maybe some of the, if there's been any community resistance. So ADUs have been allowed, at least when I was doing code research coming into this presentation, as far as I can tell, they've been allowed, at least since the early 20th century. And at that time, they were a very common housing type in a lot of places in the country. So I'm not aware that there was a time where that went away and ADUs were simply not allowed in the code. So I think for this town in particular, they were really, as far as I can tell, probably not really ever outlawed. So it's always been a part of the urban fabric. It's always been something we've allowed. And some of the regulations actually go back to those days. that 60 foot from a front lot line provision for a detached unit. I found that in the 1940s code. So I think Portland is very lucky in that it's always added, at least in the zoning code, not that everyone was doing it, but it's something you could do. As far as pushback through the years, we used to regulate them much more tightly. So that 75% or 800 square foot provision used to be, I believe it was 33%. That had to be a third of the housing size. So that was much more restrictive. And actually, sort of community feedback and community involvement, they got us to rethink that and expand it out to 75%. So my impression, and I've worked in some jurisdictions that aren't as permissive with this type of housing as well, is that Portland, from a regulatory stance, has embraced it a lot. Now that we're seeing such a takeoff in permits, we do get more concerned phone calls. I think that's fair to say. People wanting to know how that garage, how did that become a living unit, how was that allowed, and having to answer for that. So we do see more of that. But I think overall, it's that's the minority. I think mostly people accept
alter the existing part of the house to make it an ADU, then your existing house is a type of code. Will that trigger making the rest of the house up to code in areas?
So he's asking if converting a portion of the house, of the existing house to an ADU, if that's not up in current code, would the entire house have to come up in code? My caveat will be that's a better question for a plans examiner, a fire line safety examiner. My understanding is that's not the case. If we're looking at ADU and the attachment point to the house, as long as we're getting that 1 hour firewall type separation, I think we're looking at what's being added new or what's being newly converted as new into code. That being said, there's a lot of complexity with building and energy codes, and I would say probably to get the final answer, I would talk to a fire life safety examiner about that. One from the back, yes.
So we live on a corner lot and we'd like to put a new structure behind our existing house and needs to meet that 6 foot setback requirement. But then we would want the entrance to the ADU to come from the adjacent street, so would that require an adjustment?
This be a detached structure you're talking? Correct. So the question was for a detached ADU on a corner lot where it's going to have